This is Paul Schmid. Welcome to the Pursuit Zone. After 68 days and 3,200 kilometers by canoe, Ian Finch and team completed their Pull of the North expedition, a source to Bering Sea descent of the Yukon River. Ian is an adventurer and researcher who travels to remote locations to learn about the ancient traditions and ways of life of First Nations people. An important component of this adventure is for the team to immerse themselves in the story and landscapes of the Athabascan First Nation people, who, more than 10,000 years ago, walked from Asia across the Bering Land Bridge to settle the Yukon River region. You can learn more about this expedition at pullofthenorth.com and more about Ian at ianefinch.com. Ian Finch, welcome to the Pursuit Zone.
Hello there. Thank you for having me.
Ian, I was reading one of the news articles that you had posted on your Facebook page, and it mentioned that you were some sort of like a physical trainer. So that led me to want to ask, is that what you do for your day job? And the second part of the question would be then, how do you find the time off to go on a big adventure like this?
Yeah, so that's that's where I earn my daily bread. It's training people to get fit, and it can range from anybody from young people, 17-year-olds. We help drug rehabilitation people to sort of like find fitness again, and I also train people who are training for long distance events, obstacle events, marathons, and also adventures as well. We've also trained people to join the military. So it's a very broad range of people and stereotypes.
And how do you find the ability to get the time off to do a big adventure?
Luckily, I'm on a contract where my company can allow me time off. Unfortunately, I don't get paid while I'm away, but I've got some flexibility there to sort of go away for a week or 2 weeks at a time every few months. But luckily, they allowed me to take the 3 months off to do the Yukon trip, which is very, very generous of them to let me go.
How did you first get started in doing adventures like this?
I started literally just exploring the woodlands and surrounding areas of where I live in the north part of London. And then I sort of progressed into the mountains of Wales and Scotland in England. And I would go on sort of mini 3 to 4 day expeditions with friends, and we would camp up on the top of mountains and those kind of things. And then I decided sort of to push it further afield. So at one point I decided to walk from the centre of London to Paris, and I raised money for that. And I just really wanted to try and push myself and push the boundaries a little bit and see what was out there in the world. And then after that, I went to Greenland after that. So I have a real passion, as you know, for native cultures and indigenous people. So I spent time with Inuit hunters in Greenland, and it's kind of progressed and perpetuated from there. And each trip, I'm really trying to add more depth and more story and more learning. And it's been an incredible journey so far.
What was the genesis or the spark that got you interested in First Nations cultures?
I have my dad to thank for that. Like me, he's an outdoorsman. He's a hunter and a fisherman. At my mum and dad's place, they have a big bookcase, and a lot of my dad's books are based around archaeology, history, First Nation people. More importantly, there's lots and lots of books on Native Americans. And as a kid, I used to look through these books, and there was one book by a gentleman called Edward Curtis, who was the first man to document the Native American tribes all over America. And it's just a book of incredible photographs. And when I saw that book, I was just sucked in and drawn in by the native headdress and the dances and the spiritual beliefs of the Native Americans. And ever since then, I've had a real fascination with Indigenous peoples and First Nation peoples, and also the music. I'm a very musically minded person, and the music and the connection between the music and the rituals and the people is something that really touches me. And it's I'm just very drawn from a different place towards Indigenous people and First Nation people.
For the Pull of the North expedition, you put a team together. How did that team come together?
Well, initially the trip was just going to be me. So the initial sort of plan for the trip I was going to go fly into British Columbia. I was going to build a birch bark canoe with a First Nation people from that region, and then I was going to descend the Yukon on my own in the birch bark canoe. But when I found out that the canoe was a couple of $1,000s to build and an extra 2 or 3 weeks worth of time, I had to sideline that idea. So then I decided to do it in just a standard open canoe. But I really wanted an objective view of the journey. I'm a photographer and a very low-level emerging filmmaker, and I wanted to have someone else maybe to view the journey and document the journey. So I went onto a website, a British website called Explorers Connect, which is a website, a one-stop hub for adventurers, adventure photographers, and anybody interested in the outdoors. And I put an advert up for a teammate on there, and about 12 to 15 people applied. And the person that I chose was a filmmaker from Montreal named Caroline. So we joined up and we teamed up and we was going to do the journey together. But then I thought I wanted to create a real sort of emotive photographic story of the journey. So I've been following an American photographer from Brooklyn called Jay Kolsch for about 2 years, and his pictures are incredible pictures. They really, really are just truly sort of take you into the moment of adventure. So I emailed him, we had a Skype call, and I said, would he be able to pop along at certain points on the trip to photograph certain elements of the journey? And he declined. What he did say was, would he be able to come along for the whole trip? And obviously I quickly agreed to that, because I knew that in that 3 months he could record some really on the spur of the moment, which is I think what pictures are all about, is capturing the moment and the emotion of the moment. So it was fantastic to have him along. So 2 became 3. And then after that, we had to sort of level up the numbers because we had 2 canoes. So we found a guy in Montreal called Martin, and he was one of the first people in Canada to cross Canada by canoe in one hit. So he came on board for his sort of like just pure experience and skill level. And that was it really. And we didn't meet as a team until a week before the expedition. So there was a lot of risk involved with regards to sort of personalities and egos and skill sets. But we fit together really well. And apart from a few minor differences of opinion, which is just natural, the team really gelled together well.
It looks like you had 4 tents. Is that true?
That's correct. So we were initially going to have two-man tents, but because we were spending obviously so much time with people in canoes, we thought that kind of having that 1 tent each and having that privacy just for the time where you're asleep would be a good thing for the expedition, just to have that time where you could go and just read a book on your own and just have that private time. And we found out that was when we really got into the journey and you've been with people for 2 months, that's a real special time to look forward to have that time on your own.
I'm interested in some of the logistics of this. And, first of all, how do you get all this stuff? I'm probably assuming wrong, that you're bringing stuff from the UK to Canada. So how do you get all your stuff to the starting point? I guess would be my first question.
Well, there's a lot of logistics to start with, a real lot of logistics, a lot of planning, and a lot of in-country planning as well. So I could only plan so much from the UK. But luckily, Martin, the guy from Canada, Quebec in Canada, because he had done the cross-Canada trip, he had a lot of logistical experience from last year's journey. So he was really on board and active and proactive in Montreal in getting stuff sorted. So I went to Montreal with literally just my outdoors kit. So I had no paddles, I had no sleeping bag, no tent. And luckily we had sponsors on board like North Face who supplied tents and sleeping bags. We got sponsored some paddles. So that all got sent in country to Canada. And then myself and Caroline, the filmmaker, we drove from Montreal to Whitehorse, which is nearly a 6-day journey of about 5,000 kilometers with as much kit as we could carry. So food, all our sponsored equipment, paddles, waterproof equipment, thermal equipment. And we took as much as we could to Whitehorse with us.
And the canoes then met you in Whitehorse?
That's correct. So we had made an arrangement with a company in on the banks of the Yukon River in Whitehorse called Canoe People, and there's a gentleman there called Scott who's the owner, and he's fantastic. He was so helpful, and we paid for 2 second-hand canoes, and he kept them there for us until we arrived. And then we picked up the canoes when we were there, and we stored them at his facility with all of our food for the whole of the expedition. And from there, we organised into canoe barrels, which are blue bear-proof barrels. We worked out our food for the whole expedition on site at the Canoe People Canoe Centre, and a lot of planning went into the organisation of food and resupplies and stuff like that. So we spent 3 to 4 days working that all out, and it was quite a stressful time to work out exactly how much food we would need.
So then did you get to Canada about 2 weeks before the start of the adventure?
Yeah, it was about a week and a half before the start of the journey. And that journey across Canada itself was incredible. It was an adventure of its own. So we arrived about a week and a half into Whitehorse, and then we did 3 to 4 days worth of prep. Again, just organising all the food, making sure we had enough calories, and we had enough days worth of food. We got some food sponsors while we were there, which was really good. And then we organised our flights into the source of the river and just really finalised all of our equipment and went over all of our equipment, double-checked all of our equipment, finalised all of our resupply, logistics. And it was just sort of like dotting the I's and crossing the T's as such, and making sure everything was prepared and ready, because once we were out in country, there's no real going back as far as logistics goes, because you have a real lack of communication signals and stuff like that. So we had to make sure everything was taken care of.
What can you tell me about the canoes that you're using and the paddles?
So the paddles were Kissay paddles, which is spelled Quessay, and Norquay paddles. So we had 2 paddles each, just in case one breaks, you've got your spare paddle. And then the canoes we used were clipper canoes. One of them was 18'6", and the other was 16'8", and they are fiberglass canoes. So they're like lightweight, really transportable canoes, and they are like rocket ships when they go through the water. So when we had them really loaded down with a lot of equipment, we could still make some really good ground and make good speed in the canoes.
Can you describe for me, what it is that you see when you start this adventure, say when you're going through Canada? And I'm kind of wondering, I'm curious about, how does the landscape change as you go from Canada into Alaska?
Flying into the source of the river, so we had the canoe strapped to the side of the float plane. We flew from Whitehorse, which was about a 35 to 40 minute journey into the source of the river. And the mountains of British Columbia, which is where the river starts, the river has many sources, and it starts from a glacier that feeds down to numerous sources. The mountains are probably the most rugged and remote and sort of untamed mountains that I've ever seen. Even at that point of the year, May, just mid-May, they're snow-capped. And you feel out there, there's a very isolated and alone feeling sort of out there in British Columbia, in those mountains where the river starts. Everything's obviously glacial fed, so that the lakes and all the surrounding lakes are glacial fed, so the water is crystal clear down to about 50 feet. And I would probably say for quite a few hundred miles, so the river goes from lake system to river system to lake system to river system continually for the first 100 miles maybe. And you're just channeled by these mountains on both sides the whole way down. As you pass down into a little bit further down, so you go down towards Dawson City, sort of the old Klondike region, the Gold Rush region, everything becomes more lush and more green and more almost like a tropical feeling. And there was times when we woke up in the morning and the sound of the birds and the sound of the animals, it almost had a jungle feeling, and it almost felt like the Amazon at times, where you're enclosed into this river where there's really dense tree wilderness on one side and mountains on the other. You just feel very isolated, and it's an incredible feeling, a really incredible feeling. And it's a beautiful, beautiful dense wilderness as you go down past Dawson. But as you come out to Alaska, things do feel very different. there's a greater feeling of exposure. So the weather changes when you get towards Alaska. I don't know why, or maybe geographically there's some reason, but you feel very, very much alone out there in Alaska. It's the expanse is so huge, and I used to climb every time we stopped and there was a mountain behind us or a bluff. I would always climb the bluff to get a better objective of the river. And once you're up pretty high, you can see for 50, 60 miles across the tundra and across the mountains, and there's nothing out there. And that adds to the sense of isolation in Alaska. But I would say the main differences are the tundra up in British Columbia and down through Canada. It's mountainous and so picturesque and so beautiful. But Alaska is more remote.
What did you see for wildlife?
We saw a lot of moose. Moose patrol the rivers and they cross the islands that you sleep on a lot. And wherever you go, there's always moose tracks and baby moose tracks. But the problem is where the moose go, the grizzlies go, because the grizzlies go after the moose, and that's a main food source for the grizzlies as well as the salmon. And we saw a lot of golden eagles. You see golden eagles every day. Owls, lynx. You see lynx patrolling the river. There was times when we were tracking wolves, and every day there's something new on the river as far as wildlife goes. Something new you learn as well. I had a tracking card with me, so I was always tracking footprints and stuff like that. But you're surrounded by wildlife 24/7 on the Yukon.
What do you have to deal with in terms of rapids, and how many portages did you have to do along the way?
As far as portages goes, we only had to do one in Whitehorse because of the dam, and that was a 500-600 meter portage, which is pretty much nothing as far as portages go. After that, it was no portages at all for the whole of the journey. So we were literally, wherever we were stopping and putting our canoes, that's where we were putting up our tents, etc.
It is interesting for me that you say portage, and I'm wondering, that's probably how the Canadians were saying it. Did you say it differently before you went on this trip?
I'm not sure. I think I've always said the word portage. I mean, I've only ever used it because I've only ever portaged on this trip. So maybe I did take it off the Canadians that were on the trip.
Were you guys able to carry guns? And if yes, did you?
No, we weren't allowed to carry guns. First of all, we didn't have licenses, so we couldn't legally buy the weapons. We had bear spray, so if there was any encounters or close-up encounters with bears, we would have used the bear spray. But a lot of the native and the tribal people that we met along the way were dumbfounded at the fact that we weren't carrying weapons, because we passed through a lot of bear country, and there was, even a week before, on certain elements of the trip, there was bears chasing people off the river pretty much. So they were quite surprised that we didn't have any weapons of any sort, and there was a few smiles and laughs when we told them we had bear spray. But luckily we didn't need any of that. We avoided the most dangerous animals, the bears out there.
I noticed that you finished several weeks ahead of schedule. How did you manage to do that?
It was purely out of a desire just to make as many miles as we could every day. And I think one of the main factors was that on this journey, on the first sections of the journey, were quite hard physically. So we became stronger very quickly. And then once we started getting towards Alaska, because of the wind and the weather, we then had to tackle that. So we became we adjusted and became stronger there. And before we knew it, we were making 45-mile days when we had predicted to do a minimum of 30-mile days. And our projections for the journey and the time and the finish times were based on 30 to 35-mile days. So because we got strong so quickly, and we were not tiring during the day, because our dietary logistics were really worked out, we were managing to do 40 to 45 miles a day. So if you multiply that over another 20 or 30 days, that extra 5 miles a day, we were making a lot of time. So we managed to finish 2 weeks early, which was a real surprise for everyone, because the last 3 weeks were really, really, really difficult because of the wind and the weather in Alaska, in the coastal regions.
On your Facebook page, there's photographs of you guys using sails on your canoes, and I'm wondering if you had a chance to use those and how they worked out.
Yeah, so we were sponsored by Wind Paddle, and they supply the circular sails that you put on the front of the canoe. So whenever you've got a backwind, you can pop up the Wind Paddle, and it will just add to the rear paddler. The front person doesn't have to paddle, so they get a break, and they just steer using this paddle. And we used it once, but after that we actually didn't use it because we never had a rear wind, we never had a backwind. It was always a headwind or a side wind. Unfortunately, much to our disgust, we were quite miserable about that. But yeah, so it just sat in our canoes for pretty much the whole of the journey.
So as a cultural researcher looking into the First Nations people, what do you feel that what is your role as a researcher?
On the trip or prior to the trip?
On the trip.
The main drive and the passion behind the trip was to learn about the people of this region, because the river is so long, the 2,000 miles, the breadth and width of the cultural sort of diversity on the river is very large. And I thought that if I could sort of use this trip and this time and and meet the people on the river, I could just gain an incredible insight to what life is like on the river for the native people. And my role on the trip was to creatively direct where the story was going for the trip. The story for the journey was to document our passage on the river, but it was more so to meet and interview the First Nation groups on the river and find out how life is for them in a modern world. And we found that there's a lot of changes happening with the First Nation communities on the river. And it was my job to sort of focus the story on that, and also the photographic story on that as well. So myself and Jay, the photographer, we really worked hard on building a story, a photographic story that would really tell a true and honest emotive account of the journey and of our journey meeting the people. So it was bringing all of those elements together to create a real authentic perception of the Yukon descent.
Are the Athabascan people is everybody part of that community, or that's just one of the communities of people along the river?
Yeah, so the Athabascan people are a certain region of the river, and then you have the tribal groups within the Athabascan region. So along the whole of the river, there's Athabascan people, there's Cupik and Yupik people, and the Yupik are the tribal groups that live out towards Alaska, and they are the Yupik Eskimos. And within those regions, you have the smaller groups. So as you pass through each village in some cases has a different language or different dialect of language, different spiritual beliefs. So each time you go into a certain community or a certain village that sometimes has between 70 to 300 to 400 people, you're learning something new, you're exposed to something new. And it was quite difficult as well, because when I was trying to build rapport with people so we could speak to them and learn about their sort of ways of life, I was referring to their culture as if I'd known it from a tribal group upriver, which may have been only 30 to 40 miles away. And it was very, very different in this new village, in this new community. So I was constantly having to adapt my approach in each village that I went into.
What's something that you learned about these people that you hadn't before you started the adventure?
The thing that I learned the most was the fact that there's still a very, very, very strong connection to the animals and to the land, even in this modern world where there's modern technology beginning to emerge for them to fish and things like that. But a lot of the elders and a lot of the people around the 40 to 45-year-old age, there's a huge connection to the land still, a very much a physical connection, obviously, because of the animals and them hunting, but a spiritual connection to the land, which is really what I wanted to know about. I wanted to know about creation stories. I wanted to know about what they learned from their grandfathers and grandmas before the white people arrived in the region. But every person we spoke to still spoke about the land in such a beautiful, poetic way. And we found out for them still the human and the natural and the spiritual world is still one. And you don't find that really in sort of modern developed sort of cities like London where I live. There's not so much a sort of a thought towards that. But out there is still a passionate link. And it's all about honouring their ancestors and honouring their spiritual beliefs and things like that. And that was one of the main takeaways that I had, and one of the main takeaways that I learned from this journey.
Were you able to learn anything useful in terms of skills or anything that you could apply on the expedition, such as fishing or anything like that?
We were taught quite a lot of trapping and skills and things like that. We were told about them. We weren't shown them. And we weren't really in a position to use those skills. If we probably would have if we had had to, but we weren't using those skills as such. So there was no survival skills being taught or anything like that. Really, for us, it was more a search for knowledge and wisdom from these people.
I'm curious, and I want to talk a little bit about the photography and the filmmaking part of the project. You go into this type of a project when you have an idea of what you want to get out of it, and you have to work with these other photographers and cinematographers. You know, how do you guys decide, and what do you discuss up front in terms of who's going to own the content and what we're going to do with the content, and you know, to ensure that you know your kind of vision gets realized?
So with regards to the filming, myself and Caroline, we discussed well before we went about the storyline. The story is the most important thing because that's what you're going to be expressing. That's the main thread of the whole journey is the story, why we're there, what we want to share with people, the message that we want to put across. So we had to really clarify that before we went because that led the way we filmed the expedition. So myself and Caroline really clarified that before we went. The journey was predominantly about the people that we were going to meet and about life on the river, the life of the indigenous people on the river. When it came to us returning about a week and a half ago, we made the decision that we were going to make the documentary ourselves. But we've actually been approached by quite a number of production companies in the UK for them to produce the documentary for us. So the idea is who's got the rights to the footage and the story at the moment is still hanging in the balance because we're still sort of in negotiation with some of these production companies. But if that doesn't happen, we're going to produce the documentary ourselves, possibly through a Kickstarter campaign, and then aim the documentary at film festivals like Banff and a couple of the bigger UK film festivals. And with regards to the photography, the agreement that I had with Jay before the expedition, because I didn't pay him to come on the expedition, he was going to recoup the possible money from his images through magazine deals and editorial deals after the expedition. So this week we've been putting together a package for a well-known adventure magazine in the UK. We're hopefully that's going to be a big part of this magazine feature in September, so hopefully he'll get some work off the back of that. So everything really as creatively was just instincts, really just trying to make the film, create a really in-depth emotive story about the journey, and hoping magazines and documentary film companies would jump on board and resonate with that story, and hopefully we could make something of it after that.
What about yourself? I know that you've on other adventures have done some filming, and you mentioned you're sort of a beginner filmmaker, so to speak. And did you bring any cameras along, or were you doing any of your own capturing of images?
No, so I brought a camera with me, but that was almost like a backup DSLR camera if the main camera went down. So Caroline, as she's a filmmaker in Montreal, she had a lot of equipment, a lot of microphones, and she has a Sony FS700 camera, which is a really top quality camera, and she had that in a pellet case with her for the whole journey. So that was our primary filming camera. And then Jay had his Nikon camera with numerous lenses, etc., and he had that in a pellet case too. So we was forever being super careful with all the equipment. But so all I had on me was just a standard DSLR with a good lens, and I was taking images as well and taking photography. But I was shooting very small elements filming wise, because me and Caroline were using the good camera, the good Sony camera for that because of its high quality output.
Earlier you had talked about how you're interested in music, and I'm wondering, does the music of the people that you spoke to there, does that play any part into the footage that you captured?
Yeah, definitely. So we interviewed numerous people that played music for us in some of the sort of really remote communities out in Alaska. So they have circular drums out there that have caribou skin on them. And some of the songs, for example, were to welcome the salmon up the river The salmon is a very important animal for the fish because they harvest the salmon when the salmon are running, and they dry the salmon and they eat the salmon over the winter. So they have numerous songs that they sing on the banks of the river to welcome the salmon and encourage the salmon to come and encourage them in good numbers and healthy salmon. And we also, when we was in Anchorage in Alaska, we went and filmed native dancers from Yupik, and they did numerous drum songs for us and in tribal dress. And those songs represent the coming of animals, maybe people going out on a hunt, the coming of food, sometimes love songs, wedding songs. So music is a very, very, very important part of native culture in this region. It's a very, very, very big part of their way of life, their traditions, their history. So it was a very strong element that we had to include in the documentary.
Ian, looking back on the adventure, what would you say turned out to be the most challenging part?
The most challenging part, I would say, would be when we really moved into the wider regions of the river in Alaska, when the river started to widen. And then the weather changed. The weather significantly changed from sort of river with current, and the river slowed. Once the river widens, the river slows, and the terrain became a lot flatter because of the tundra and the coastal sort of influences. That means the wind swept across the river, and we had a lot of challenges with the wind, the head-on wind. There were certain days where we couldn't paddle at all. We had to stay in our tents because of the wind and the rain. And that, in turn, when you're fighting against the wind and the rain and you're paddling into a headwind, all the little niggling injuries that you've picked up along the way just through constant repetition of thousands and thousands of paddle strokes, those little niggling injuries start to flare up, the shoulder injuries, the hand injuries. I've still got actually numbness in my left hand from my little finger down to my wrist, where just the constant effort and struggle that you're putting in to paddle against wind. I also damaged my shoulder. So the weather was the most difficult aspect to deal with, and the changing of the weather, because the weather changed in Alaska from burning sun to horizontal rain squalls with 3 or 4 foot waves in a matter of probably 5 minutes. So it was very difficult to deal with the weather out there. But that's part of the adventure. That's why I liked the difficulty and the challenge of all that.
Ian, what's next for you?
At the moment, what's next is basically decompressing from this journey, really taking stock of what we've done, but really bringing the story around creatively, getting the documentary started and making sure the story's represented in the right way, and getting the magazine stories out there and the photography, making sure that's up to speed, and we've got really great packages for people to see. And I really want to share this story with the world, and that's what's in the immediate future, to get that really clarified and out there. As far as adventure-wise, I'll probably, for the moment, I won't be doing anything, but I've got a couple of really big plans for next year, possibly teaming up with some production companies to go somewhere and film some stuff with more native and tribal people. So watch this space.
And if people want to locate your space, how can they contact you? How can they find you?
Well, there's a really good photographic depiction of the journey on my Instagram, which is at Ian E. Finch. That's my Instagram handle, or my website, which is www.ianefinch.com, or Facebook. You can find me on Facebook as well. Yeah, everything's on there. Lots of pictures that I haven't shared are going up now. Lots of blog posts that we've all put together are going to be going up over the next week or two. That's really going to give you an insight to what life was like throughout that journey.
Ian Finch, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Recorded August 19th, 2016. For more great podcasts, visit thepursuitzone.com.